Hi there guys, it's Mike from MCQ Bushcraft here and welcome to episode 1 of the build series. If you watched my 2018 channel update at the beginning of this year, we talked about a trip me and Megan will be going on in the spring of this year in April, where we'll be driving through Europe, rooftop tent camping, but primarily exploring northern Scandinavia. We've been to Sweden and Norway before and we always wanted to go back there and do a bit of travelling, be a bit more mobile, and obviously we're going to need a vehicle to do this. I'm going to introduce the vehicle and also talk about what I need to do to it before the trip. It's a Jeep Cherokee XJ, 1999. It's a right-hand drive export model in 2.5 turbo diesel. When I first bought the vehicle, it was in a pretty good state, but it had some really nasty tyres on it, some 31-inch remoulded mud tyres. It had a rough country 4.5-inch suspension lift on it, short arm. It's come a long way though, and we're going to go through this bit by bit. And first of all, we're going to start with the engine bay. So this is the engine just here. This is a VM Motera 4-cylinder 2.5 turbo diesel. Produces 118 horsepower at 4,000 RPM and 300 Newton meters of torque at 2,000 RPM. This engine isn't really spoken very highly of in this country. It's usually commonly referred to as the boat engine, but most of the comments about the engine are through high maintenance costs, but also just through hearsay and actual lack of experience from people who say something about it and then somebody else listens to that and repeats it, and a reputation is born like many. But it's actually a very good engine. It started life as an agricultural engine. It was never intended for boat use. You'll find it throughout Europe in lots of different vehicles, primarily agricultural, so small tractors. It was very commonly used in Austria, and it functioned very well for what it was made for, and it really likes being under heavy load. The main complaint of the engine, and this is where a lot of misunderstanding and confusion comes from, is the cylinder heads. It has a separate head for each cylinder, and they did that because they made a 3-cylinder, 4-cylinder, 8-cylinder version of this for different agricultural applications, and it just meant they could use the same cylinder head for each one. And if one cylinder head went, then you take that off and you just replace that one. This is the Mark II of the engine, the latest one from my knowledge, so it's a little bit different on this. If you take one cylinder head off, you disturb the others and they all need to be removed, new gasket, and it all has to be done. There used to be a separate gasket for each cylinder head, but those days are generally over and they were weaker anyway, so people did away with them when they could. Now they use a multi-layered gasket and you never really get any kind of head gasket issues. And most of the time people don't keep an eye on the coolant level. The coolant level drops, you get an air pocket in cylinder head number 1, which is usually the one that goes in that case. You get a hot spot and then you get a crack. So most of the issues with the engine are just down to poor maintenance, and usually when these engines go, it's so expensive to do the job that people just scrap the vehicle, and that's basically why you don't see too many of them getting rebuilt anymore. I do all the work myself, I can do the rebuild myself and have done, and I had some issues with the cylinder head. Didn't have any head cracking issues, but a stud that holds one of the valve arms on snapped. Snapped clean off on the face of the block. We tried drilling it out, and a friend of mine used an easy out and he snapped the easy out off inside the stud. So we couldn't get that out, tried drilling that out, no good. Even getting around it and picking it out, it just didn't work. So I decided to strip the engine bay down and do a bit of a rebuild on the whole thing. And I got 4 new cylinder heads, new gaskets. It's a fairly simple job, to be honest. Most people could do it themselves. It's just a lot of time and losing a lot of skin off your knuckles while you're doing it. But basically you just measure the piston protrusion, measure the liner protrusion, select your gasket. In my case it was the standard gasket because nothing had really changed. And I did that rebuild just over a year ago, and the engine's been running really, really well. One really good thing about the engine is it has no cam belt or timing chain at all. It's all gear timed, and this number 1 fuel injector just here, which is the only injector with a wire coming out of it, has a sensor in it, and that sets the timing for the whole engine. So the engine can actually adjust its timing depending on how much those gears wear, so it should never ever lose its timing. So all in all, it's actually a very robust engine, and some of the things I've done to it, you can see that I've replaced the actual heater matrix, and there's some pipes coming out of the heater matrix just there. I've plumbed in copper I've run it past the viscous fan, just here at the front. I changed the viscous coupling on the fan as well. That's something you want to keep an eye on. Did put a new battery in just here. I mean, that battery is from Halfords. They said it was a 3-year warranty. It's lasted a year, it's already dying. I did check the alternator, the alternator's fine. It is the battery, it's not holding charge. Something a little bit quirky here, this is part of the rear axle. The actual breather on the rear axle is blowing oil, and we have the other breathers just here for the transmission transfer case and front axle, so we can't flood or contaminate the oil if we do any wading through heavy water. This is the fuel filter, obviously worth changing every now and then. And we have a sensor down in there on cylinder number 3, which I did change as well, and I do carry a spare, and that sends temperature to the dash and tells you how hot the engine's running. Gives you an indication anyway, so that is worth changing as well if it's really, really old. But one major change that I did on a lot of the engine really was just studding it. I'm not particularly keen on repeatedly putting bolts into aluminium, and these don't have to be torqued very highly at all, but I've got studs on all the rocker arm blocks and things, studs here, studs here. It just means the nut can be taken off and the stud remains in place, which I think is far better than having to undo a bolt out of an aluminium thread all the time. Another thing I've done is plumbed in a new intercooler. The original intercooler lived underneath the vehicle just here, and there was a sort of boxed out section from the cowl that housed it. But the problem is if you're going off-road and you're using the vehicle for what I use it for, it gets clogged with mud. So I moved the intercooler to the front. I've plumbed it in using aluminium 2¼ inch pipe, and that pipe there just means that you keep your boost. So if you use silicone pipe, it expands slightly when the turbocharger's going, but you don't want it to do that, so this pipe here stops that happening. I've also raised the expansion tank by 2 inches. This is just a small mod you can do. It just keeps that air pocket in the expansion tank much higher. One thing I change as well is the thermostat. It lives in there on the top of this water gallery here. So I do change that as well when I service the vehicle and drain the coolant. And I've also replaced the water pump as well and the serpentine belt. This is an additional thing I've put on. This is an oil catch can. It just catches all of the moisture and the rubbish that comes out the crankcase, so it doesn't get recirculated back and get burnt up in the engine. But you can see where the intercooler comes in. We've actually had to do away with the factory air intake, which would have been a box here with a standard air filter in. I've had to put this temporary thing on with a cone filter just there, and this is going to be gone. We've got the ECU just here as well. This can be fully submerged, this ECU, without damage, as it's set in a silicone housing and the connectors have rubber seals on them. Another thing I decided to do was put a new radiator in. I originally had a massive intercooler mounted on this vehicle, huge intercooler at the front. It was just gigantic, way too big. I had loads of turbo lag off of it, and so I put a smaller intercooler on that kind of matched the original size but a different shape. It meant I had to put a new cowl on because the original cowl has like a lump at the bottom for that intercooler, as I mentioned before. So I got the cowl off the petrol Cherokee and put it on here. It took some jigging around, but it's on there now, and all in all this vehicle runs very, very cool. About 85 degrees and at full load just below 90, so I've never had any overheating issues since I've rebuilt the engine. It's been running real well, and even on long drives when I'm driving for 8 hours up north, it just chugs away. But you do have to take into account that it's not a particularly powerful engine and not got a lot of horsepower, a lot of torque as diesels do, which is what they're for. But you get about 35 to 36 miles per gallon on long drives and about 30 to 31 just driving around normally. So that's the engine, and we'll move on to the drivetrain and then the axles and then go through some of the other stuff. This is the front end of the vehicle, and this is the front axle and diff. This is a Dana 30, good axle, as long as you don't start putting massive tyres on it, which I haven't. But it's been pretty good. It's an open diff, so there's no locker or traction aid in there. It's just a standard open differential. I've added on a Rock Crusher diff cover. The steering is all factory. That's all going to need to be changed out. That's not tough enough for what I generally do with the vehicle. and I've already bent this and had to straighten it whilst I was out off-roading. I had to use a jack to straighten it. So all these tie rods, all this steering needs to change really. I've got a drop pitman arm just there as well to help with some of the angles here, because obviously you start lifting vehicles, all the geometry changes and you can get really nasty bump steer. Fortunately I don't have any of that, I did at one point. And I've put in a extended track bar just to accommodate the lift, so it can bolt into the original point just here. And what I've done just here is I've fitted a M12 bolt instead of a standard M10 with a 12.9 tensile strength bolt, so it's a pretty strong mounting point just here on the axle. I've kind of made my own sway bar disconnects by drilling and putting a sleeve over. That needs to be changed as well. The bushes on the sway bar are almost completely gone and I'm really starting to feel it when I'm turning. But in terms of what I've done to the axle, I haven't done a huge amount really. I've changed obviously the seals in there, done the side carrier bearings, I haven't touched the pinion, and I've put on the ends of the axles some outer axle oil seals just to stop a lot of the rubbish getting in and touching the main seal that's here for the diff, for the fluid in the diff. So I filled these axle tubes full of grease, so that really helps stop the water get even further in, but that will need all dragging out and redoing because it's been 2 years and I've been through a lot of water, so I expect that will need replenishing. I have strengthened some of the mounting points by adding extra steel just here for this upper control arm mount. I've also done the same with the lower control arm mounts and added extra steel, so it's almost like a mini skid plate. One other main thing I did do with the axle is I replaced the axle shafts as well. I put some heavy duty aftermarket axle shafts in there with just slightly larger eyes around the U-joint. So all in all I've been really happy with the axle, but let's move to the rear one. This is the rear axle. This is a Dana 35 and this is probably the least desirable axle that you can get on the Cherokees. It's not a bad axle, but if you do push it and you start putting big tyres on and you're giving it loads and loads of acceleration and wheel spinning everywhere and you abuse it, you will snap an axle shaft. But in a diesel like this where it's really all torque and slow speeds, I've not had any issues with it. I did do a rebuild on it. I replaced the side carrier bearings, the oil seals, the wheel bearings, did the pinion bearings, pinion seal, crush sleeve, preloaded it all correctly, and that was when I was doing a re-gear. I re-geared this to 410 with some aftermarket gears, and they were used sadly. I had very little knowledge of it at the time, but used gears are quite hard to get a good gear pattern and re-gear. I did get it to be fairly quiet, but it was just so noisy. I ended up taking it out and going back to 373, which is what the gear ratio is of this axle and the front one. If a good axle came along like a Chrysler 8¼ or a Dana 44 for the right price and it was a straight swap, I'd put it in, but until that comes along I'm not too worried about changing it. I've done quite a lot of off-roading in this and been up some fairly steep climbs and wheel spinning and never really had any issues. I do have 2 spare axle shafts for this at home and I've put the same diff cover on as well, but I've just noticed this shock is leaking. These rough country 4.5-inch lifted shocks come with the lift kit. They've been in for a while. All 4 need changing before we go. In fact, that one there doesn't even do anything behind me, and that one there is now leaking, so that one's dead too, which probably explains the bit of bounce at the back end. This is the lift kit we're running. It's a rough country 4.5-inch lift, short arm. Although I've made some changes to it. It was pretty hard on the suspension, or on me driving it when I first drove the vehicle, but I did make some changes to make it way more comfortable. I've got a 4.5-inch lifted spring there. I've just put on some aluminium tubing on there and added a new bump stop just to tidy this area up. Obviously packed in some undercoat and grease under there so it's not a water trap. And drilled a hole through the bottom of the bump stop. One thing about these vehicles, you get a bit of a water trap with dirt here if you let it build up, and especially it builds up on the top of the bump stop. So if you drill a hole through the bump stop, it allows it to all drain away if you get in deep water, which is just a useful thing to do if you're not a fan of rust. It's got a spacer on top, and the reason that space is there is on the back end. I added a leaf spring relocation bracket that dropped it down and allowed you to adjust the leaf spring at 45 degrees, so that lifted it by another 1.5 inches, so I just had to put a spacer on, and I cut the spacer in half and put a layer of rubber in just to take away some of the impact. But that shock needs changing as well, and we need to get longer shocks because it can over articulate past what the shock can actually give out. One thing I have done as well is added in a hockey puck bump stop, so that's 3 hockey pucks bolted together. You don't actually need to bolt it to the bottom, you just put a bit of grease underneath it and it sits there quite happily, and it just stops the tyre over articulating and ripping the arch off. You do need to do that unless you want to cut away your wheel arch with a disc cutter, which I didn't want to do. I also put a control arm drop bracket in, which it lowers the mounting point for the control arm at the bottom and the top as well. It does both, and that gives you your factory geometry back, and again aids articulation, drive quality. It stops all of that judder getting sent straight up into the frame here, and actually allows the suspension to do the work. So that was a massive change, and it did a lot actually. So this is the relocation bracket on the back. It allows you to mount the leaf spring hanger at 45 degrees, which gives you a much better ride quality, as a lot of the impact is taken up and it is able to move freely rather than just being mounted straight up like that, transferring all that energy up into the body. It does give you a bit more lift. I didn't want any more lift on this. It had a 4.5 inch lift on it, which was fine for this tyre size and everything I did, but I wanted better ride quality. So I put this bracket set on. This is a rough country bracket set, and it just gave me more lift. So I had to balance the front out with that spacer, which I didn't really want to do, but it's done now, and it's not going to go any higher than this. I don't think it should do. But these are the leaf springs that I got with the lift kit. The Jeep came with them. It came with a full leaf pack, and they're worn out. So I need to think about new leaf springs. But that brings me on to tyres really. I said when I got the vehicle I had some horrible 31 remold mud tyres on, and I went to 32 by 1150 BF Goodrich all-terrains. I went with an all-terrain because I'm on the road a lot with this, and I'm not off-road for the majority. When I used to run the mud terrains, they were terrible on the road, especially in the wet. They really affected the braking distance or stopping distance of the vehicle, because I think people look at a mud terrain and they think, all those big lugs on the bottom of the tyre, it must have tons of grip, but on a road it's exactly the opposite. You know, you start skidding around in the rain and your stopping distances are effective. It's not too safe. So because I'm on the road more than I am off-road, even though I do a lot of off-roading, this truck is used for work, doing the bushcraft courses, lugging all the gear and spare time as well. This tyre here has served me really well. They've done brilliantly. I air them down to about 15 psi, and I run them on a 15 by 8 steel wheel, modular steel wheel, and it's got a -32 offset to keep the wheel far away from the front control arms, because on full lock the tyre would be touching the control arms. But let's move on to the bodywork and the bumpers. So as you can see, I don't have the stock bumper on the Cherokee anymore. I've actually got an aftermarket winch bumper. This is made out of 4mm and 6mm steel, very strong bumper. You can see there's a mounting point for a winch just here. I don't have a winch. Something I'm considering, but they're a lot of money and we don't really have it in the budget. So I do have a Turfer winch that I'm going to borrow for the trip potentially if I'm not able to secure a winch for it. But it connects to the actual frame of the vehicle very solidly. Just one plate of steel welded straight to the bumper, hugs the frame, ties into the steering box bolts, and it sandwiches the frame, so you have a plate on the other side as well with actual tie-through cylindrical pieces of metal that the bolts go through. Good recovery points on it as well. So one major change I made to the vehicle was to this rear quarter panel here, and this is called a cut and fold mod. It usually comes all the way down to here. None of this is here, this is all stuff I've added on, but this panel comes down to about there, has a plastic wraparound piece that clips in and connects to the back of this stock bumper here. The reason I cut all that away, a lot of people do it for ground clearance, a lot of people do it for rust because it's a problem area. I did it because it was just totally rotten. You know, the drain plug was hanging out and everything was a bit corroded, so I chopped all that off, put a new plate of metal in, treated it all, made it level with the boot so it does extend out a little bit more inside. But there aren't a lot of options in this country for aftermarket bumpers that adhere to that kind of change that you make. So I decided to take the stock bumper, put some baffles in it, strengthen it, and add to this box section on the outside. And you can actually high lift jack off of this now and lift the vehicle. There is a little bit of movement still in it, but we're going to run this back to the actual frame and tie it in to a tie-in kit I made. You can buy those as well. It's an insert in the back of the frame. Got videos on all of this coming up after this video, so if you're interested you can obviously stay tuned for those. But it ties all of this in together, makes a very solid recovery point, stiffens up the back end, stops the body flexing so much, and really toughens up that area. Another piece that I made was a frame stiffening kit that runs along the bottom of the frame, made out of 6mm. Put some box section on it, extended the bump stop with it as well, because you need to do that. I've had this tyre come up and tear this plastic arch off in the past, so you've got to extend the bump stops if you're not prepared to actually cut the panel away, and I wasn't. So this frame stiffening kit ties into all the factory bolt holes, including the front anti-roll bar, the sway bar, and it ties into the tying kit we made as well, so it makes for an incredibly stiff rear end, which is great on a vehicle. But in later videos we're going to be stiffening the whole uniframe on this vehicle, so if you are interested in that then you can stay tuned for that as well. This is just a small change that I made, putting on some hood vents. I don't think they do a huge amount, and the engine stays pretty cool without them, but on hot days when you turn the engine off, it's just somewhere for that residual heat to escape. So one thing I considered when I bought the vehicle was the condition of the actual body of the vehicle. This is what you call in this country a monocoque, or a unibody or a uniframe. It's actually neither, it's more of a uniframe vehicle because it still has a frame. It's just permanently connected to the bottom of the actual vehicle. So if it was too corroded and really heavily used as an off-road vehicle, I would have never have bought it. I inspected the underneath of it when I bought it and it was in really good condition. And one job I wanted to do when I bought it was strip it down. So I took all the arches off, all the interior, even the actual mirrors, the lights, the tyres, the axles. We stripped the thing down. It was just a shell. Got a shot blaster underneath, cleaned the underneath of it thoroughly, dealt with any rust spots, as in if there was bad areas they'd be cut out, new metal would be welded in, and then we treated it all. So I used Dinatrol. It's like a cavity wax that creeps about 20 centimeters and actually has a lot of rust inhibitors in it. It's a brilliant product. And then a much heavier coating of undercoat underneath, not rubberized, more of a wax undercoat. And I did that 2 years ago, and I occasionally come back to areas where I'm doing changes and I clean back the area, and I'm always quite happy to see good steel underneath. And we've got new paint work, so the bottom of the doors, even underneath all the window trim, underneath the mirrors. So you can see the sill as well, and the step here has been done. When I stripped it down I did the inside too, so the seats came out. Everything was etch primed, bed lined. You can see the bottom of the door there has been done, and inside the door too, so the door cards came off, windows came out, and all the inside of the door was treated and cavity waxed as well. Really big job was the drip rails. The drip rails on the Cherokee. This took me about 4 days to do this job. I had to strip back all of the roof in this area, clean it all, treat it. I did that about 2 years ago, etch primed and bed lined. It's really held up very well and been very strong, even with trees and branches brushing against it when I've been off-road. So that is quite a big job, and getting this off as well and just treating around the bolt holes that connect it to the sheet metal is quite important too. You know, I wouldn't rely on this. I've actually got a front runner Slimline 2 roof rack to go on here, and that'll be coming up in a later video. A change I always wanted to do was eliminate the flange here that connects the wheel well to the floor pan of the actual boot. You usually have a lip of metal, much like you do on the sill. Problem areas on all old cars, you end up with rust building up between them because the paint in there is very thin. I continuously welded on the inside of the arch and ground this all the way around, and completely got rid of that actual lip there, so that no water or dirt can ever get in there again. Did that a couple of years ago, been solid, rust's never come back, no issues. So it just makes it much easier to clean as well, and you're just eliminating problem areas where these old vehicles develop issues and you end up having to cut bits out and weld it in the future. So I shouldn't really ever have to touch that again. And you can see I've made a plastic arch as well. These arches are actually off of the older model Cherokee. I didn't like the way that the newer arches on this model connected to the sheet metal. They use like some nasty strip of metal that always rusts, and it's just not good. So these are actually mounted on in a very different way than you would normally expect, and they're actually about 1 millimeter away from the actual body panel here. When I stripped the vehicle down and did this paintwork on the bottoms of the doors, I took the arches off too and did the same to the underneath. Treated it all, got it all sorted out. There wasn't actually too much rust, there's just a little bit here and there like you'd expect for a vehicle that's almost 20 years old. But what I've used is actual metal washers with rubber backs to them to sandwich the holes where the bolts go through, and that way no water can actually get in. And it's a really sound way of making an area easy to clean. And all that work I've done, I didn't just want it ruined by mud and grit flying up in there. So that's why I built this wheel well, and I did that a while ago, and I've stripped it down once every year at the end just to take a look, and it's still absolutely spotless under there. And with all the water I go through, I'm quite impressed really. It's held up really well. With the paintwork, I obviously bedlined the inside and put these mats inside. You just take these out, take the dirt out. And I was really happy to see when I bought this vehicle, it was one thing I kept my eye out for, was the floor pan. And it is solid as a rock. So obviously whoever had this Cherokee before me took the carpets out a long time ago, because I've seen some seriously bad condition floors in these vehicles. So that's the Cherokee, and that's where it is to date. I've probably missed a load of things out because it has been 2 years. I've been working on it fairly consistently over that time, and you kind of forget the finer details of some of the jobs you did. I mean, there are things like ball joints, lots of bushes, lots of stripping it down, bedlining the engine bay, cavity waxing inside the box sections, all these sorts of things. So I hope you join me for this episode, or these episodes coming up, this series, the build series, and obviously after that's done, we'll be on our way. Hopefully we'll have a roof tent fitted by then and the front runner roof rack, and we'll be ready to go. And then we can obviously start getting into all the kit as well that I'll have to take with me, and myself as well as Megan, because she's be coming along as well obviously, and bringing all her gear too. So hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you very, very soon in another one. Take care, guys.